Good afternoon, colleagues. I will speak slowly, so don't worry. So I have a couple of questions before I get started that's along this line. How many of you grew up in a home where both your parents were from the same country? Raise your hand. How many of you grew up in a home where you spoke only one language in your home? Okay. How many of you grew up in a home where your parents were from two countries, two cultures, two languages? Okay. Okay, when those of you answered that you had one culture, one language, that's a monoculture. And when you grew up with more than one language, more than one culture, more than one religion, you end up with more than that. So I want to take a look today. Why is this important? And what difference does it make to kids, especially our kids in our school? So first I want to look at what is culture. So according to this, our culture is what we see. We usually think it's of language, dress, religion, food, and the way a person speaks. We think, that's it, right? So when we first see a person, that's the first thing we think of. But culture is also a system of shared values, and shared beliefs, and shared concepts. A culture is a framework from which we interpret and make sense of life and the world around us. According to cultural anthropologist Paul Hebert, culture is learned rather than instinctive. Something caught as well as taught by the surrounding environment and passed on from one generation to the next. So our culture or traditions, they're picked up from childhood and they affect our adult lives. We call those our traditions, right? Shalom Aleichem wrote in his story, The Milkman, Tevye. My favorite version is Fiddler on the Roof from the American movie. Tevye said, because of our traditions, we have kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Anatevka, we have traditions for everything. How to eat, how to sleep, how to wear our clothes. For instance, we always wear our head covered, and we always wear a little prayer shawl. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, everyone knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Without our traditions, our lives would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof. We have a lot of traditions that we don't know where they came from. Why do you eat Salat Olivier on New Year? You probably don't know. But it's a tradition, right? And oftentimes we think that people that look like us, sound like us, they should have the same traditions. But we don't. We don't. So that brings us to third culture kids. Again, what's the point? The point is that, first of all, we have all of these traditions, and then we come into a school where we have third culture kids. What is a third culture kid? A third culture kid is a person who spent a significant part of his or her growing up years outside of the parents' culture. Traditionally, we talk about foreign service kids, children that come to us because their parents work for the embassy, consulates. Sorry, this is a very Americanism, corporate brats. That's children who go to different countries because maybe their parents work in a certain industry. I come from Texas. We have a lot of kids that leave and they go to different countries because of oil. We have military brats, pardon the expression, kids whose parents take them and they live in different cultures, but oftentimes they're on a military base. And missionary kids that go from place to place. So how Why third culture? You just told me that they come from one culture. They have three cultures because their first culture is their home culture. Oftentimes it's just a passport where they were born or their parents' culture. Their second culture is their host culture. And many states, like in our case, it's Russia. So they come to us maybe from, I have a little girl in my class who's from Cameroon, but she's been here in Russia for many years. Okay, that's her second host culture. But the third culture, it's the shared commonalities. It's the things that happen only because they are the child of a diplomat or a corporate child. That means they will experience things that they would never experience in their home culture. And more importantly, when they return to their home culture, they will not have this. They may not have a driver, a security service, a really nice apartment, middle of downtown Moscow. Those are things they will never have. But when they leave, they will think of Russia as these things that they've experienced. So when they come back, wait, I've grown up. I really loved living in Russia. I'm going to go back. Oh, well, now you have a problem because now you're living in Russia not as a third culture, but as a first culture. And now you can rent an apartment, but renting an apartment in Moscow is going to be a lot more expensive than you thought. You can't get a job because you can't get a visa. You can't. So there's all these things that they will no longer have that they thought embodied Russia, but it didn't. It was their third culture that they were experiencing. Does that make... Okay. So where does that leave us? Let's look at a different, you think, well, everybody that comes into Russia or comes into our schools, they're not all third culture because they're not all fitting into those. But let's look at another group called cross-cultural kids. It's a person who's living or has lived in or meaningfully interacted with two or more cultural environments for a significant period of time during childhood up to 18. We've all experienced other cultures after being an adult. How many of us went to a university in another culture or did something else, spent a few weeks? This is not the same as when you're a child. So when we look at cross-cultural kids, we have a big difference. So cross-cultural kids, I have to say, when I first saw this definition, I went, aha. Because I had a significant interaction. When I was 10 years old, my brother married a girl from Spain. He brought her home from the Navy. She spoke no English. So till I was 18, so for 8 years, from the time I was 10, I spent on and off time with them. And I discovered only after I was in my 20s that I actually understood Spanish. Don't ask me to speak it, but I can pretty much tell you. And I always wondered why my little town, my fairly large town, always felt very small. And I always wanted to leave. And this is why. We'll get to this. Cross-cultural kid. They could be a traditional third culture kid. They could be bi or multicultural. They could be or bi multi-ethnical. Borderlanders, those who lived on the border and they go back and forth. My favorite, educational cross-cultural kids. This is where we see the majority. If I push this button, what's going to happen? We see the majority, I don't know where it went. Okay, of our kids here. You bring in a Russian child and you put them in a classroom where everyone speaks English and everyone's from someplace else. The first year, they walk around like this. The second year, the third year, they are speaking English. They've already changed many of their little quirkies. They have new games. So, because when you're in a monoculture, you have your own games. If I say Sigdagatov, you know what it means. In the U.S., we don't say that. We say Scout's Honor. So it's a difference. And you're going to have those when a kid comes into our culture, into our school. They have to learn each other's games. And sometimes this is a big difference. Sometimes this is where they have a hard time because they just don't understand, all the others around them. Okay, a domestic TCK. That can be a child whose parents work with another group. We often see this in the U.S. with missionaries whose missionaries locally, maybe they go and work with a Native American tribe. Maybe they go and work with some other group of refugees or something like that. They get a different perspective, and so they change. It changes how they view things. International adoptees, they look like they're maybe from another country. I have a friend who adopted 3 little Indian girls. And the oldest one, beautiful girl, looks very Indian. And then she says to her, you say, "Oh, what is your name?" And she says, "Hi, I'm Sangeeta," because she grew up in East Texas. And that's the way we talk in East Texas. So children of minorities, it's a different atmosphere. And children of immigrants and of refugees. So these kids, cross-cultural kids. My children are cross-cultural. I'm an American. My husband's Russian. My children were born in the U.S. They were here for a while, there for a while. You ask them, "Where are you from?" They're going to pause. That's their first okay, where am I? And so if they're in Russia, when you ask them that question, they'll say, "I'm Russian, but my mother's American. I was born in the U.S." If you ask them that and you're in the U.S., and they'll say, "Well, I'm half Russian." Or they'll tell you what state they lived in last, or where they were born. I was born in California, but so you get this really long story. I was born in California. I lived part of my time in Russia, but then I'm from the U.S. I lived in Texas. And so they'll give you this story because they really don't even know where they're from. And this is the thing. Why is this important? Cross-cultural kids live between worlds. They're not completely ever apart. They'll never be 100% one or 100% other. A friend of mine who was a college student said to me one day, "Jonathan, I am so confused. I don't know. I'm too Russian to be American and too American to be Russian." And she went to the States when she was 8. And that's the way our children think. They're like, "Okay, I'm sorry. My youngest daughter went to leave Russia from a visit to us, and she goes to passport control, and she hands the passport, her Russian passport, and she said they asked her a question in Russian, and she looks at them. She left Russia when she was 2. She refused to speak Russian, and she looks at them and she said, "I don't speak Russian." And they're like, "Nadezhda Alexeyevna Orelchikova, are you kidding me?" So it's a problem because they don't fit in, they don't know who they are because they're a combination of those two. And so once we educate them in an intercultural, interlanguage environment, they're going to be different. They're not going to be a Russian child. So one thing we have about customs and beliefs is that, first of all, what we see is the customs that are just the top of the iceberg. But there's a whole bottom of the iceberg. And here's the problem nowadays. How many of you own a pair of jeans and a t-shirt? But, come on, right? How many of you watch YouTube? How many of you, these kids watch TikTok? Eventually, we all kind of look alike, right? I remember I came here in the 90s where you could tell if a person was a foreigner by their shoes. And you can't tell that anymore, right? So we think we are alike. But when we get to the bottom, we have our worldviews and our values and our beliefs, and they're so different. And we expect these children to come to us and have the same worldview that we have, and they don't. In their environment, it might be okay to lie. It just might be not a problem. Let me tell you a quick story about environments. My husband and I are quite different. We discovered that in Bible college in month number 3 of marriage. We were taking a Bible college class together. My husband this was his first year speaking English in the U.S., and we're taking a test. And I just graduated from a university in Tennessee. He decides to look over at my paper. And I do the American thing. In America, you get caught cheating, you get kicked out of the university. Just like that. That's it. No, excuse me, what happened there? No, you're gone. So my husband is Russian, and he looks at me and he goes, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm covering my paper. And he said, but you're supposed to help me. I said, if you need help, ask the professor. And he was like, you're my wife. And I was like, yeah. And there's the professor. Go ask him. So we are married almost 30 years and he's still sore. So please don't bring it up if you happen to talk to him. Okay, so the big problems that arise with TCKs or cross-culturals is that they have a lack of common knowledge. We cannot expect these children to know what we know. Why? Many of these, especially in ISOT, many of our children are children of refugees and immigrants. In the immigrant life, you spend a lot of your time making ends meet and trying to deal with cultural problems, visas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes you just don't have time or you don't think about what they don't know, right? And so that's a big problem. We cannot expect them to know certain things. If we want them to know it, we better make sure we tell them. If we expect them to raise their hand like this, we better teach it to them. Because in America, we raise our hand like this. Okay? So there's a difference. And that cannot be expected for them to know. We have to tell them. These kids are always missing someone. When my kids were in Russia, they missed their American grandparents and their American cousins. When they were in America, they missed their Russian grandparents. They're always missing someone. Their life is never complete. They're not going to have all their cousins and grandparents and relatives in one place. They're always, could be their best friend. Somebody they've grown up with, but they've had to leave. I have a child in my class right now. It's her first year here. Her parents are diplomats. Her parents love Russia. They went to the university here. She does not love Russia yet, because it's so different. Besides the snow, she has to deal with friends, etc. So, and missing her relatives. So, trying to preserve their own culture. These kids want to keep their own culture. So there's certain things that we can't do. We have to be very careful when it comes to them, what they believe, the certain things that they do, what they eat, reminding them, hey, I know you don't like grechka, it's okay. Get mom to send you something to school. Because there's things that is just so different and we can't push that on them. Let them preserve their own culture. Have trouble connecting with monoculture kids and adults. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because they don't get monocultures. I'm sorry, it's true. We're like, what? You don't understand that the world is very large. My family, I have a brother and a sister that lived in the same town all their life. Same town all their life. And they don't get my kids because my kids think things like, instead of tights, they use their Russian word kolgotki. And they don't understand that they think tights are for ballet and kolgotkis for everyday life. So it's a totally different, So also keeping up with friends and family online it gives them no time to make local friends. Sometimes they think we have internet. I can just come to school. I do my time. I go home and I talk to my friends online. I don't have to make friends here. I can just quickly, talk to my friends. They feel they cannot relate to other nationalities and cultures. Some of our kids don't understand that other cultures have their quirkies, but they all are the same. Okay? And of course, telling the truth and cheating, we already talked about. How can I help these kids? Okay, so back to the kids that I never assume they know something. I had a little girl one time, I said, did you understand this verse in her pace? She said, Miss Jonnettt, I'm 12, I don't understand anything. And when she told me that, it reminded me that I'm expecting them to know something, and I can't do that. So I had this one little guy, we had discussed anteaters. And I said, what do anteaters eat? And he said, food. And I was like, okay, what do anteaters eat? He said, food. And so I showed him this picture because we had already discussed this picture. And I said, what is this? He said, an elephant. And I realized I have to give them the information that I want them to have. And I have to use videos. I use anything, pictures, videos, anything that can help them understand what they're doing. One of the things I do is I found this really great book, and it is saying that trying to teach the kids that they are all alike. And so what we can do is, the best thing we can do for these kids is to remember, show them how they are alike. Show them what they can do. Because they're different, but they're all the same. They're still kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.